take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and share about my research tonight. And I'll be talking about my dissertation research on the long-billed dowitcher. And just like how the long-billed dowitcher probes in the mud for their invertebrate prey, I've been probing my data sets and the literature to figure out how these birds live their lives and what that means for their future. But before I get into that, I'm going to briefly introduce myself and the systems that I work in. So I'm Kirsti Carr. Like Concha said, I'm a second-year ecology PhD student at UC Davis. And because I'm in my second year, today I'm mostly going to be sharing preliminary results from my data so far. And I'm in Dr. Kevin Ringelman's lab, who spoke this past February and gave a great overview on waterfowl. But my research, like Concha mentioned, is specifically focused on migratory sandpipers. So I study their movement ecology and their full annual cycle. So that means their migration, non-breeding, and breeding behaviors. And before UC Davis, I was an avian ecologist at Point Blue Conservation Science. I would guess most of us know Point Blue. They're a pretty cool local organization, and I came to really familiarize myself while at Point Blue with these wetland matrices here in the Central Valley and also the Klamath Basin, where I got to study shorebirds. And it was an incredible experience, and with Point Blue's support, I was actually able to take some of the data that I collected while staff there and bring it to UC Davis for my PhD, which gave me this awesome head start. And yeah, but I got my start studying shorebirds in Arctic Alaska, which I'll talk about a little bit. But before all of that, I worked as a seasonal technician on a variety of bird projects throughout the US for about 5 years. So my first was a job in the mountains of New England studying Bicknell's thrush, which is a really cool species related closely to, closely related to gray-cheeked thrushes and Swainson's thrushes, but they nest specifically in balsam fir forests in New England and eastern Canada, and then spend winter entirely in the Caribbean. Super cool life history and an awesome bird, and it was here that I really solidified my interest in birds. And let's see. After that, I went and worked at the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. I moved across the country to here in California, and that was an excellent traineeship that led to 4 more years of raptor work for me, which mostly happened in the Goshute Mountains of Nevada, where I banded hundreds of raptors and watched thousands migrate overhead, and also saw countless sunrises and sunsets across the mountains of the Great Basin, which were beautiful. And that's the little tent site that I lived at every fall for 4 years while working at the Goshutes. It was beautiful, and I only feared for my life sometimes during a few windstorms. So it was great.
Can't see the screen.
Oh.
You need to tilt the screen differently. All I see is a quarter of it. It's not on the video.
You're not seeing...
I see partial screen.
You're seeing partial screen.
Yeah,
Okay.
because the tilted...
I see the presentation, Kirsti.
The tilt of the camera. The tilt of the camera is... So I can't see it.
Okay, yeah, but you should be able to see it on your computer screen, so.
It's not tilted the way it should be.
Yeah, but you shouldn't see it, like you don't, like here, you don't want to see it in my video, you want to see it on your computer screen.
Right, and it's not there.
I think we're...
Sorry, maybe just go.
Yeah, I'm going to keep going. Yeah.
Are you in the Zoom? You're in the Zoom app, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Let me see what I could do offline and figure out how to help you.
Maybe you guys can open a chat between the two of you and then resolve this offline.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, great. Good call. Okay, so All right. Anyway, so where was I? Let's see. I also worked in Minnesota. So this was this really neat red-headed woodpecker recovery project at Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve. And there I learned a ton of different really cool technical skills, like taking blood samples from birds and putting transmitters on birds, and then also using these really long telescoping poles with a camera attached at the top to check the nest cavities of these woodpeckers for contents, which was really fun and challenging. And I had great mentorship along the way. But as I was meandering through these jobs, I was learning a lot, but I also didn't quite feel certain about the system that I wanted to work in. I hadn't really felt that click yet. And at a certain point, a friend of mine who I met on the job asked me if I'd ever thought about working with shorebirds. And I had not really ever considered shorebirds at all at that point. But it gave me pause because although it had never worked for me to be set up on a blind date with a human, I was much more intrigued to be set up with a bird. So that kind of festered in the back of my mind, and I kept an eye out for shorebird-related jobs. And I finally landed one in 2021, working on a nest survival monitoring project that happened to be located in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which was love at first sight for me. So I fell in love with both the landscape and the animals in the Arctic. It was just incredible to fly in a helicopter over miles and miles of contiguous, unaltered wetlands in the Arctic. And I loved the duality of its harshness and ruggedness on the tundra, but also its delicacy and its ability to foster so much life, so much new life especially. And I got to watch caribou and bears and wolverines and waterfowl and sandpipers rear their young in this incredible place. And although I was transfixed with all the creatures, like this really sweet long-tailed duck who would not get off her nest so that I could measure and take data on her eggs, and who really diligently and dedicatedly plucks all of the down feathers off of her breast to line her nest bowl, like eiders do, long-tailed ducks do that too, and it's truly like the softest material that I've ever felt. So incredible. Anyway, all of these creatures really were so inspiring, but it was the shorebirds that took my breath away. And I just loved going to sleep at night with the sun high in the sky at midnight or 1 a.m. and hearing the breeding calls and breeding displays of these sandpipers, of Dunlin and Long-billed Dowitcher, stilt sandpiper, and waking up and hearing them still. You know, there's no stopping on the tundra. It's just this mad dash, you know, to raise a family. And I also loved watching their behaviors of protecting their nest. And this video might be a little bit choppy, but I'm going to show you a pectoral sandpiper female who's just hopped off her nest to try to entice me, who, you know, is this voracious nest predator, away from her eggs. So this is called a distraction display, and it's pretty similar to the plover broken wing display that you might recognize from killdeer or snowy plovers. But sandpipers have their own distraction display that we call a rodent run, and you might be able to tell why if the video works well enough. So you can hear her making this really incessant little screech, and then she's fluffing up her feathers and kind of staggering along to look like maybe an injured lemming or vole. Anyway, it's really been just the privilege of my short lifetime to get to witness all of this beauty and all of this new life on the tundra, like these really freshly hatched Dunlin, including a little sibling that's still on its way out of the egg. And these moments have just been unforgettable for me. But as much beauty as there is on the tundra, there's also a lot of hardship too. So we see a lot of nest failure and depredation on the landscape. This is a Pacific loon nest, so not a shorebird, but these eggs were eaten and destroyed by a predator, probably because of the way it was done, either a gull or a parasitic jaeger. These are two parasitic jaegers. And of course, depredation is a natural part of the ecosystem, but as our world is changing, the balance of these intricate food webs can get thrown off. And it's in this rapid global change where we see these issues crop up for our Arctic nesting birds. So new predators are expanding into the Arctic that are changing these predator-prey dynamics, like this arguably incredibly cute red fox and her kit. Red foxes weren't historically in the Arctic, but as climate warms, they're now moving up farther north and north. And they're creating a problem for both Arctic foxes, which have always been there, and our nesting birds. We're also seeing common ravens move into the tundra when they previously weren't there, and predator dynamics are also shifting outside of the nesting grounds, here in the non-breeding area too. We've experienced unprecedented land use change as a result of European colonization and imperialism, and non-breeding wetland habitat has been both destroyed and fragmented. We all know this in this room. Here in California, we've lost about 95% of our wetlands. And on the breeding grounds, oil and gas development is also a huge problem for these birds. And of course, again, nothing new here, but climate change is a huge factor for these birds. So these predictable weather patterns that used to happen for our birds across the Pacific Ocean to help assist them in their migration or help time their nesting with these big pulses of food resources are now becoming unpredictable. So shorebirds aren't the only ones to experience these risks, and the data really support that. I would guess that most or all of us remember the headlines when this study by Rosenberg and others came out in 2019 that the US and Canada have lost somewhere around 3 billion birds since 1970. It's a huge number. It's incredibly precipitous decline, and it's very concerning. And it becomes more complex when we break this down by group. So in this graph, we're looking at percent change in population, and on the right, this is growth, and on the left, that's decline. And here we see that waterfowl populations have actually expanded pretty dramatically since 1970. And there's certainly winners and losers within the waterfowl group, but this population increase is definitely real, and it's likely due to the incredible efforts of conservation that we've seen in the US and Canada, and Dr. Ringelmann talked about really expertly last month. But the pattern does not hold for other groups of birds, and the trend suggests that shorebirds, which we can see up here, are declining somewhere between 30 and 40%. So it's pretty concerning. And what's even more curious is that these birds are relying on the same habitats, right? We see shorebirds and waterfowl using the same places. They're all wetland-dependent species. And a lot of shorebird researchers are really working hard to figure out why this is happening. We know that there's difference in timing of their migration and their non-breeding movements. We also know that there's difference in habitat requirements. But we really don't fully understand why the huge discrepancy is happening. And that's because shorebirds are underfunded and understudied, and we need to learn more. So when I had the opportunity to take the data that I gathered on long-billed dowitchers, seen here at Point Blue, and turn it into a dissertation and graduate project, I really jumped at the chance because I want to be a part of this solution. So that brings me to the long-billed dowitcher, which I imagine a lot of us are familiar with. We have tons of them here in the Sacramento Valley. But for those who might not be, they're a relatively small-bodied bird. They weigh about the same as a small apple. And they're an obligate migrant. So an obligate migrant means that the entire population moves to their breeding ground in eastern Russia and the Arctic and subarctic tundra. And then they spend summer there, lots are born, and then the entire population migrates across this yellow portion of this map south to wetland habitats in the non-breeding ground shaded in blue here. So this range map is going to be important, so just take a little snap of that for later on. And dowitchers really mostly rely on freshwater wetlands, which are of course especially imperiled, but you will find them in brackish water and you'll find them in saltwater too. But yeah, they use a lot of flooded agriculture and private wetlands here in California Central Valley. And like many birds, they replace their feathers twice a year, so you might see them here, you know, in this grayish brown plumage in winter, and then in spring and summer, they turn into this really pleasant rusty red. So conservation initiatives put their population losses somewhere between 50 and 75%, which is pretty precipitous. And academic research also supports that. This is a study from 2023 looking at some of the most common shorebird species in the US and Canada. And if we zoom in here, we can see that the long-billed dowitchers are likely experiencing some of the most severe declines in these shorebird species. So they're not doing well. And we've seen some recently published papers from the Pacific Flyway and from the Arctic breeding grounds with work that I've been involved with that really support this, that long-billed dowitchers are not doing well. So what research has been done on them before? Really not much. And there's a lot of knowledge gaps that I'm hoping to fill with my PhD. But I also wanted to highlight this monograph written in 1950 by Frank Petelka, who is a vertebrate zoologist at UC Berkeley. He studied both mammals, small mammals, and birds. And in this monograph, this was when we really definitively, as a scientific community, found consensus on the fact that long-billed dowitcher was a different species than short-billed dowitcher, which is a notoriously difficult identification in the field, right? And he did this by examining hundreds of specimens, museum specimens that were mostly collected here in the Central Valley, which I think is pretty cool because of our wonderful dowitcher population. And because I'm a proud Central Valley inhabitant, I also want to draw attention to this wonderful summary of the monograph written by Christopher Swarth in 2024 because, and that was published in the Central Valley Bird Journal, which is awesome local publication. And I really recommend reading this if you're interested in long-billed dowitchers and you love a story about biologist Frank Petelka and his relationship with Rollo Beck, who collected most of these specimens. And it's a lot more digestible than the monograph itself, which is a little dry. So anyway, besides that, as some of my colleagues at Point Blue have published long-billed dowitcher specific data, and at Max Planck Institute in Germany, they've come out with some recent papers, but there's a lot of potential still for this species. That's about it. And I'll get into where I want to go, but first I'm going to give some overview of the insights we've learned from this work here. So we have 37 members of the sandpiper family breeding in North America, and despite there being a really vast and incredibly diverse array of reproductive displays and behaviors in the family, and I'm not biased, I swear, it's awesome. Almost all of these species can be binned into two generalized reproductive strategies, so the way that they reproduce. The first is these individuals on the left, and this is a conservative strategy. So these birds have very high mate and site fidelity, meaning they mate with the same individual in the same place year after year. They're socially monogamous and have biparental care, so both members of the pair are caring for those eggs and potentially for the young, and they're pretty early to breed. So some examples, this isn't extensive or complete, but are the ruddy turnstone and western sandpiper and dunlin and bar-tailed godwit. So all great birds. The other strategy is an opportunistic strategy. And these birds have low or no mate and site fidelity. You know, they're mating with different individuals in different locations. They're polygamous with uniparental care, so only one parent is incubating for those eggs and caring for the young. And they're late to breed. So some examples of those are the phalaropes, red phalarope down here and red-necked phalarope up top. And these guys are polyandrous, so one female mates with multiple males, and the male incubates the eggs and does all the parental care. And then there's pectoral sandpipers and buff-breasted sandpipers, where one male mates with multiple female. They're polygamous. But buff-breasted sandpipers actually have a really cool breeding strategy where they lek, so they create these really cool leks, and I've gotten to see that a few times up in the Arctic, which has been super special. Anyway, going back to these 37 species of sandpipers, with the data that we have available to us now, as far as we know, there's really only one species that blows this scheme out of the water, and you can probably guess who it is, right? It's the long-billed dowitcher. So long-billed dowitchers have very low mate and actually effectively no mate or site fidelity. They're also monogamous with biparental care, and they breed fairly late in the season. So they kind of crisscross this line and are very enigmatic, which is super cool. And because of this work done at Max Planck Institute, we now are pretty confident in this. Dowitchers are also pretty unusual for their molt migration strategy, which I'll define in a moment, but it's worth mentioning that this molt migration strategy is super common in waterfowl and ducks and geese, but it's likely only shared by one other sandpiper here in North America, which is the Wilson's phalarope. So long-billed dowitchers leave the breeding ground in mid to late July in their breeding plumage, and they migrate part way and then stop at these staging areas. And here they replace all of their body and flight feathers in this rapid pre-basic molt to go into their non-breeding plumage. So the birds are relying not only on enough energy to replace all of their feathers, but they also need to refuel sufficiently to continue on southward to their wintering areas. So this is a 50 to 60 day period in July through October where these birds need a ton of food resources and really reliable habitat while they're replacing their feathers and have actually reduced flight capability. We also know that in July through October, especially in the western US, that's often the time of year where we're experiencing the most exacerbated drought conditions, right? There's just very little reliable water on the landscape, and often water will blink on and off really rapidly. So this might be a very vulnerable life history strategy for these birds on the landscape we live in today. So why long-billed dowitchers? We know they're experiencing very severe population declines. We know they have this very enigmatic and potentially unique breeding strategy, and they also have this potentially vulnerable molt migration strategy. So these two life history traits right here make these birds very unique from an ecological and evolutionary standpoint, and I think gives great reason to further study these birds. And it also leads me to the question, how does life history influence conservation success throughout the long-billed dowitcher's annual cycle? So I'll begin to answer this question by both describing novel life history traits and also analyzing potential risks and threats that they're exposed to throughout their lives. And I'm going to do this in 3 chapters of my PhD. So I swear I'm going to do it. Anyway, the first we'll focus on continental movement, behavior, and strategies. So these really broad scale movements that these birds are taking throughout their year. And the second is going to zoom in on a finer scale to regional and temporal movements and habitat quality, specifically on the non-breeding ground. And the third, we'll look at cross-seasonal effects of movement and habitat use into the breeding season. So a cross-seasonal effect occurs when a decision an animal makes at one stage of its life influences its success in another. So, for example, the decision a bird makes in winter might affect its ability to breed successfully. That's a cross-seasonal effect, and I want to investigate that in these long-billed dowitchers. So to do this, I needed to deploy some transmitters and get some GPS data and PTT data from these birds. So while I was still staff at Point Blue, I went up to the Klamath Basin, one of those known molt migration stopover sites, staging sites, and also a location of previous research from Point Blue. And I caught a bunch of birds. We used mist nets for this process, and we also used some callback of flock calls. Long-billed Dowitchers are really gregarious. We all know we've seen some really big flocks here in the Central Valley. And a fun fact, actually, which I meant to mention, they are also pretty gregarious on the breeding grounds, so they nest in these like semi-colonial, like village-like structures, which is really so cute. Anyway, they like friends, so we fake them into thinking there's friends here. We use callback, and then we also have these little funny snipe decoys that trick the Dowitchers and sometimes trick me into thinking they're real Dowitchers too. And we catch them about an hour before sunrise. So the birds at this time are leaving their roost sites and looking to flock up for the day, potentially, to avoid predators early in the morning and to start foraging together. So I caught a bunch of birds and put a bunch of transmitters out on them, and it went pretty well. So in 2023, with Point Blue Nature Conservancy in Audubon, we tagged 30 long-billed Dowitchers in the Klamath Basin. And in 2024, I started grad school, which was very exciting, and I secured funding to tag 15 more birds in 2025. And while I was working on that, I also initiated new collaborations with two groups. One, the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and the other is the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program in the Gulf Coast of Texas. And through these partnerships, I accessed an additional data set of 62 long-billed Dowitchers. This was really exciting for me because the data that I had access to was really, specific to the Pacific Flyway. But with these new birds, I unlocked this whole other flyway, which was really cool. And that brings me back to my first objective, which is these continental movements. And through combining these data sets, we now have an area that essentially covers the entire range of the long-billed Dowitcher as a species, which is so cool. You can see here, this is the farthest, just about the farthest, most west that long-billed Dowitcher breeding has been reported. Of course, we really don't know all that much about Russia, but we also have birds from Florida, which is just about as far east as they go. They'll go a little bit farther east, but we don't need to worry about that, right? This is an incredible data set, and because of this, I can answer some bigger questions from the species scale. And you can see in these tracks the definition of these two flyways, right? That's pretty cool how defined they are. But I actually think the noise between these two flyways is even cooler because we're seeing individual birds move between flyways, between seasons and years, which is a really cool plastic display of flexibility from these birds. We're also seeing a lot of oceanic flights from long-billed Dowitchers, which is novel information. We didn't know that they would do these multi-day flights over the ocean before we tagged these birds, which is very exciting. And there's a lot of questions to ask with these data, but from the continental perspective, today I'm going to specifically focus on spring migration, which happens for Dowitchers between mid-April and late May. And we're seeing these three emerging strategies of spring migration emerge within and between these flyways. So the first is this over-ocean flight, like I said, novel information. The birds are departing in mid-May and taking about 10 days to arrive to the breeding ground. They're taking 2 to 3 days to fly over the ocean, and they're going very fast. We're also seeing a little bit more of a conservative strategy, this coastal route, where birds are moving along the Pacific Flyway, but not taking these fast flights. They're stopping over and taking about 20 days to arrive to the breeding grounds. And in the mid-continent, we're seeing a whole different strategy. They're departing about 2 weeks earlier and taking about a month to get there. And of course, this is a longer distance to travel than the birds in the Pacific Flyway, so distance is part of this, but it's not the only reason why we're seeing these changes in days. We're also seeing differences in the amount that these birds are stopping over and the duration that they're stopping over for, which could have really interesting implications for their body condition, how healthy they are on departure, and also habitat availability potentially along the route. So it's pretty exciting. My second chapter is again going to zoom into these regional and temporal movements on the non-breeding ground. And there's 3 reasons why I'm focusing here on the non-breeding ground. So the first is length of stay. And this is an animation that I'm going to play. And if you watch the date go by and their movements happen, you can see these birds are spending about 9 to 10 months of the year on their non-breeding ground. That's almost the entire year. This is a really important area for them. The second reason is that we're experiencing the steepest habitat losses and the most dramatic land use change on the non-breeding ground. Of course, like I talked about earlier, we know that land is changing in the Arctic too, but there's really unprecedented change happening down here. The third and final reason that I'm focusing on the non-breeding ground is an applied reason, and that's because we have the highest potential for intervention here in the non-breeding ground. I'll let you in on a little secret. It's a lot easier to implement management and conservation action in the Central Valley of California than it is for us in Eastern Russia. So I know that's pretty novel stuff. But because of this, you know, I'm really interested in what's happening. I'm also inspired by Point Blue, my background there. They've done a ton of conservation work here, so I'm pretty excited about this. And that was my motivation to put out these new tags this past September. And we're getting data back still from these birds. They're moving around, they're in our backyards. It's really exciting. And I think that this doesn't quite show how cool these movements are, so I'm gonna zoom in and show you another animation. So these are the birds in Klamath Basin right after tagging. They're coming down to Calusa and spending a lot of time in Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge and Delavan Refuge. They're also spending a lot of time in Sutter County, mostly in flooded rice fields. We have a few locations from just these 15 birds in the Yolo Bypass and Davis wetlands, which is really cool. And they're moving through the Delta and down to Los Banos Wildlife Area and the Grasslands Ecological Area, and spending a ton of time in these privately managed duck clubs, actually, down there, which is really cool to see. So these birds are still here for now, but as soon as they leave and head to the breeding grounds in about a month or 2, I'm going to really start digging into the habitat they were using this past winter and combine that with previous data collected too. So that brings me to my 3rd chapter on cross-seasonal effects into the breeding season. And as you all are now very well aware, long-billed dowitchers breed in very difficult to access and remote areas. So these movement tracks that we have from these birds represent the most extensive data set of long-billed dowitcher monitoring on their breeding grounds that we have to date, which is really neat and I feel really excited about. But of course, we're still really limited because these data are remotely sensed and we don't have any on-the-ground work to back it up. But through analyzing the tracks, we can actually look for high-use areas and start elucidating nest attempts, which is pretty fun. So from 2024, these are 11 likely nest attempts by these long-billed dowitchers. And what's more is that we can actually start estimating if these nests were successful or not, because we know that long-billed dowitchers have a fixed incubation period of 22 days. So long-billed dowitchers have to incubate their eggs for 22 days in order for them to hatch. So when we start looking at the nest clusters like this, we can see that at least 3 of them did not last long enough to be successful. So 3 certainly failed, and the rest, we can say potentially were successful. Of course, this is hard to, it's hard to do, but this has been done with previous research too, and it's pretty good stuff. So breeding success can be impacted by a variety of local conditions, like we talked about earlier, predation risk and weather and competition between individuals. But there's this growing body of literature that shows that the decisions and constraints that birds face on their wintering grounds might have really outsized impacts on their breeding success, potentially more so than local conditions. So proving what causes the success or failure is pretty difficult with these data, but because of the size of the data set that I've built through these awesome partnerships, I'm pretty optimistic about drawing some meaningful trends out and how some of the behaviors that I'm investigating in those previous chapters might influence these dynamics. So if we think back on those 3 spring migration strategies, that fast, medium, and slow, we can look at how those relate to the duration of a nest attempt. So here in these 11 individuals, 6 of the birds took that rapid over-ocean migration. You can see those highlighted in green here. And of those 6, all but 1 exceeded that 22-day incubation period. So again, really preliminary, but this suggests that a rapid over-ocean migration might improve a bird's chance at reproductive success. And this finding is pretty well founded in other literature on migratory birds across systems. Often arriving and initiating nests earlier can lead to higher success. And if that's actually true for long-billed dowitchers, this rapid over-ocean migration might have been selected for because it increases their reproductive fitness. But as these climatic factors and land use factors build up, it might be harder and harder for these birds to take that rapid over-ocean migration, and it actually might become a really big survival risk, right? So these birds, might be in trouble. Well, we know they're in trouble, but anyway, I'm really excited to combine these data sets and look at habitat use to start answering some of these bigger scale questions with the data that we have. So I'm going to give some key takeaways on these chapters before we finish it out. On my first chapter on continental movement, preliminary results suggest there's these 3 spring migration strategies. And on that second chapter, looking at regional and temporal movements, we've tagged over 70 individual birds, and the habitat analyses are in progress. And on that third chapter on cross-seasonal effects, preliminary results suggest that migration strategy may impact breeding success. I feel really lucky to have this data set available to me for my PhD. I get to fill these really key life history knowledge gaps on this very rapidly declining species. And I'm really hopeful about informing conservation in wetlands and working lands, both here in California, but also at a greater regional scale. And I'm also building and strengthening multinational collaborations with groups in Germany and across the Western Hemisphere. And I really think that's part of the answer for how we can help these birds rebound and recover their populations. So before my acknowledgments, I wanted to end on this slide, looking at the beautiful nests of these darling shorebirds. It's kind of hard to pick out the eggs here because they're so cryptic. But these are all birds waiting to hatch out of their eggs, and the world that they're going to be met with is a world that doesn't look like or act like it used to. And I feel so lucky to have spent as much time as I have in the career I've had, having all these experiences and seeing so much natural beauty. And also to have spent so much time watching these birds as parents and in migration and on their wintering grounds. I really don't know what my future holds, but I really hope that I have a very long and fulfilling career ahead of me surrounded by shorebirds. And the question that drives my motivation for that is this: how do we build a future for these birds? And we don't quite know the answer to this yet, but I think it's really inextricably linked to how we build a future for ourselves too. And I think we all have a role to play as conservationists and researchers and birders and neighbors to these birds, So I hope you'll all join me in that. With that, I just want to thank my many funders and collaborators who've made the work possible. I'd like to thank all the people who've helped me in the field deploy these tags, and I want to thank the Long-billed Dowitchers themselves for being such a charismatic and quirky, interesting study species. So that's all I have for y'all today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Do you need any 75-year-old assistant?
Yeah, Yeah, email me. I'll let you know. Yeah. Yeah. Bobby.
So you've had a lot of Dowitchers in hand, and like you mentioned, the short-billed versus long-billed thing is difficult. What's the usual ratio when you're catching a bunch of birds of short-billed to long-billed?
Oh, it really depends on, okay, so the first question for the chat was if I need any 75-year-old field assistants, and I said email me, so that's the first question. The second question is when I've been tagging these birds in Klamath and in the Sacramento Valley, what's the typical ratio of short-billed Dowitcher to long-billed Dowitcher? And that depends on the time of year. In fall, but mostly 100% long-bills in these freshwater wetlands. Certainly in the Sacramento Valley, I've never caught a long-billed or a short-billed Dowitcher in the Sacramento Valley of, I don't know, not a huge sample size. But in the Klamath, in September, we do catch a couple, usually. So it's still a ratio of like 30 to 1, maybe, 40 to 1. But we do see short-billed Dowitchers moving through the Klamath in the fall. And short-billed Dowitchers are, typically more coastal birds, but they do come through freshwater interior wetlands as well. Yeah. Yeah, Lynette.
How useful is eBird data in trying to understand some of these trends and how these birds move?
Yeah, most of my questions are so tied to individual behavior that I haven't thought much about using eBird data. But that being said, eBird data has certainly been, and sorry, the question for the chat was, can we use eBird data from Lynette? And eBird data has been used for migration strategy depiction, so it absolutely can be done. And it's probably something I should think about. So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from
Yeah.
Daniel Carr.
Oh, my dad.
Says, how does the multinational collaboration support your work, and does this mean that long-billed Dowitcher are found in Europe as well?
Great question, Dad. Thanks for being here. He's in Texas, so it's pretty late. How does so I think it's really important that local people are doing local work. I'm not local to the Arctic, so I'm hypocritical in that. But long-billed Dowitchers use coastal Mexico and into Central America, and I work with folks in Mexico and talk to them about long-billed Dowitcher distribution. And I'd really like to build that more into the research that I'm doing. And long-billed Dowitchers are typically not found in Europe. So the team at Max Planck, who tagged a ton of long-billed Dowitchers in their breeding grounds in Utqiagvik, Alaska, they also come over from Germany to do that work. So they can be, every once in a while, found, especially in Asia. They'll move farther west instead of down the Pacific and Central Flyway. So that happens accidentally, but typically they're not found in Europe. There is Asian Dowitcher, though, which is a really cool species, and that's also found in Eurasia, so you can check that out, Dad, if you want. Yeah.
So do you try to chase down individual birds?
I haven't. I haven't mostly because a PhD is so, painstaking, and it has me so busy. But yeah, the lag time on location data that we get is usually about 2 days, which makes it a little bit tough. It's almost, possible, but yeah, I haven't refound any of my transmitted birds yet, but I mean, if anyone sees one, please tell me. I'd love to hear it. So yeah, I did have one bird actually get predated in the Klamath Basin, and I knew that because the tag went stationary, and we were actually able to recover that transmitter and the pile of feathers, unfortunately, that it was surrounded by, and I was able to put that back out. So those sorts of efforts I've done, but yeah. Yes?
Could you say what fraction of the Dowitchers that winter in California use the inland route versus over the ocean?
I would say, you know, the sample, my sample is so low. I'm sure birds do it. I mean, compared to the population, right? It's a pretty good movement ecology sample size, honestly, but we haven't had any birds winter in California and use the central flyway. So all of the birds that are wintering on the Pacific coast are using the Pacific flyway to migrate.
Over the ocean.
Oh, over the ocean versus coastal?
Yeah, that's right.
I see. I would say it's, sorry, thank you. The question is how many birds in the Pacific flyway are using this over ocean strategy versus the coastal strategy. And that would be, it's somewhere around 50%. Yeah, 50% each way. So this rapid over ocean flight is definitely, seems to be popular. Yeah, so the costs outweigh the rewards potentially.
And it was unknown before you did this work.
I know, it's fun stuff. Yes?
I'm thinking about the advantage of the over-ocean route you might have, and is there an advantage to arriving early? I'm assuming the over-the-ocean birds are leaving at roughly the same time, or just getting the breeding ground sooner. Is there any information about how predation rates fluctuate through the breeding season? Do you have to have sort of a threshold number of nesting birds before the predators start to get active and take notice?
That's a great question. The question for Zoom is there any data on predation, on the timing of predation in the breeding grounds in the Arctic? So is there potentially a benefit to arriving earlier on the breeding grounds from a predation perspective? Did I summarize? Yeah. I think that's a great question. I would say that from a predation risk alone, I'm not sure arriving earlier would be super beneficial to these birds because the predators that they're dealing with are Arctic fox, which are, you know, using the landscape as soon as these birds are too. They're responding to snow melt, and even sometimes they're before the snow melts.
And the predators are there year-round. It's not like they're arriving.
Yes, with some migratory, but so some are arriving for sure. But my hunch is that the benefit to arriving early for a long-billed Dowitcher is that they prospect a lot. And I should have included some of those movements that we've seen in the pre-breeding season, but I had a bird that flew almost the length of Alaska before settling on a breeding area. So they're really exploratory, and that's probably related to this very low no site fidelity thing. So long-billed Dowitchers, for whatever reason, are prospecting a bunch of nesting areas and probably looking for other birds to settle down and initiate nests. And I would think that arriving early allows them to find these higher quality nest sites through this exploratory strategy that they have. Yeah, but predation risk certainly could be a factor too. And once fox, like Arctic fox or red foxes, have live young, then they're, you know, feeding at a much higher rate, and that becomes a big problem for these birds. Yeah. Oh, yes.
I was just wondering if you see any difference in nesting success between the birds that choose to nest in Russia versus North America. Because it looked like maybe more of the Russian birds are using the cross-ocean pathway.
Correct, yeah. So the question is, have I seen difference in nest success between birds nesting in Russia and birds nesting in Alaska? And I haven't looked at that yet, so I'll let you know. But for the most part, all but one of the Pacific flyway birds, yes, all but one of the birds that nested in Russia wintered in the Pacific flyway. So we've only had one instance of like a mid-continent wintering bird nest in Russia. And that bird we have multiple years of data for, and only in 1 year did she go over to Russia to breed. So it seems like there's like a connectivity thing between the Pacific flyway and Russia. Like our birds in California are really these Russian Arctic, or potentially these Russian Arctic breeding birds. So yeah, but I'm really excited to dig into differences in breeding. It'll be so hard because we're so limited by the data, but I'm really curious what's going on in the Russian Arctic, and I will get there someday. Yeah, that's also, yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Kunal Palawat, who says, have you had any memorable experiences with landowners or curious neighbors?
Thanks for the question, Kunal. Have I had any memorable? No, all interactions with landowners have gone perfectly well. Yeah, because this is going to be on YouTube, right? So yeah, but to be honest, yeah, I've mostly been met fairly positively in the field, but with a lot of communication. So. Yeah, I take that really seriously. I mean, I do catch birds on private land, and it's a huge privilege to get to be out on private land to do this work. So I'm definitely a over communicator. I'll have to think. I can tell Kunal later. I'll try to think of some funny story, but I don't have one that sticks off the top of my mind. Yeah. Yes.
So what is there like a high mixing rate between like the western and the eastern populations? And if not, is there like a large difference in like the population declines or like the overall fitness of either population?
So the question here is about differences in survival or population mixing between western wintering birds and eastern wintering birds. And what was the rest of your question?
Basically, like if there isn't a high like mixing, if they're like generally isolated, is there like a big difference in like the population declines?
Okay, I see. Yeah, and just building off that question, if there isn't a lot of population mixing, are there differences in population declines between different populations in North America? That's a great question. Most of the data, we're starting to have a more well-rounded understanding of shorebird population trends on the whole. There was a recent publication by Point Blue, and I'm looking at Bobby in the corner who works for Point Blue. Hi, Bobby. On long-term trends, 10 years of trends in populations on the Pacific flyway. Because the graph that I actually showed where I had that red swatch looking at long-billed Dowitcher decline, most of those data were actually from the east and mid-continent. So they don't really incorporate the Pacific population. So I'd say it's hard. I don't think we have enough data to really fully understand population differences. And that's part of my motivation for this work, is to look at threat exposure between these two flyways to see if there might be different experiences that these birds are having. And I would say, as far as mixing, it's a great question. We see really high wintering site fidelity in long-billed Dowitchers, but very low breeding site fidelity. So it seems like there would be population mixing because of that, because the isolation that's actually occurring and that stratification is on the non-breeding ground where they're not genetically mixing. But that being said, that site fidelity, is it still curious? Is that genetically driven or what? So it's a great question, and it's not fully understood. Yeah.
Actually, to follow up to that question, this is a strange one to ask. It might be a bit speculative. What's the chances that the offspring could be inheriting the same route, or are they trying different things after they leave the breeding grounds?
So the question, you all might have been able to hear it, but what's the chances that offspring are inheriting their migratory strategy and their wintering grounds? And
like from their parents, or
sorry, go ahead.
Like whether it's from their parents, or are they shooting a dart in the dark? Is that inherited from parents, or is it shooting a dart in the dark? So for long-billed dowitchers specifically, I think that's a really good question, and I don't know, and I'm not sure we know as a scientific community. I think that there's likely inherited, that is, like, it has been seen that birds inherit that kind of genetic information, especially because for most of these migratory birds, they're not being shown a path by their parents. They're flocking up with other juveniles and then migrating on their own. But some of my colleagues who work with Whimbrel, Hudsonian Whimbrel now, are looking at that because we're seeing pairs of birds, pairs of Whimbrel, migrate in the same, breeding in the same valley. Some migrate along the Atlantic flyway and some migrate along the Pacific flyway. So in one pair, they have these different migratory strategies. And what does that mean for their young? So we haven't figured that out yet. But it's a great question, and I'm not totally sure. Yeah, thank you. Oh, another one? Yeah. There's a lot of that, uncertainty with what's going on in Siberia and such, in Russia. This is a strange one to ask, not like necessarily conditions like with the species themselves. What about the environmental conditions? Is it the same predators, same habitat as it is in Alaska?
So the question was about the Russian tundra and how similar the community looks to the Alaskan Arctic. And the shorebird community is very different. So there's some overlapping species. There's still pectoral sandpipers, but and probably some others. But there's a lot of different organisms too. So there's stints and all sorts of different species in the Russian Arctic. But there's also a lot of circumpolar distributed predators, so parasitic jaegers and other jaegers are over there, Arctic fox are over there, bears, which aren't really a huge predator for shorebirds, but would certainly eat eggs when they come across them, are over there.
Polar bears or brown bears?
Sorry, that's a great question. I was referring to brown bears, but polar bears too. It's just at the time of year when shorebirds are nesting, polar bears are typically still on the sea ice. So there's not a lot of predation by polar bears for shorebirds. Yeah. So kind of both. Yeah.
All right. I think it's time now.
Okay, great.
And we have a few more questions in the chat, but maybe we can run through just. Actually, I think we got to cut it off. We got to.
No problem.
Back to the senior center here.
All good.
But,
yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.